Welcome, everybody. This is a brief introduction to the neurosequential model. And the first thing I'd like to do is just direct you to a couple of online resources that you may turn to if you'd like to learn a little bit more about this. And here are a couple of social media handles for those of you who are interested in seeing some of the updated content that we are sharing with people in our community. The neurosequential model is it's an approach to understanding human behavior and more specifically, understanding certain problems in development or problems in behavior and emotional functioning that emerged out of a clinical work. It emerged out of studying dysfunction, dysregulation, developmental problems. And I'm actually a child and adolescent psychiatrist, but before that, I was trained as a neuroscientist. And as I started learning more and more and more about clinical work, I kept bringing the neurobiological concepts into my worldview, my frame of reference, my approach to understanding some of the problems that I was seeing. And part of what happened was I found myself extremely, I guess, dissatisfied with what I was learning. I was, I was like many of you who are trained in clinical disciplines. I was told that the way to think about human neuropsychiatric issues or presentations or problems was to look at the DSM, use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's got all of the disorders and it's got all of the checklists but here's part of what I was running into. I was running into the fact that the human brain is very complex, right? The human brain has 86 billion unique neurons, and there are literally thousands and thousands of component parts. And I knew about all of this complexity because I'd been studying the neurobiology of the stress response systems in humans and in other mammals. And I knew that there were a variety of developmental factors that could influence how these systems organized and how synapses formed and how function was mediated. And that all of this was very, very much influenced by genetics or intrauterine phenomenon or early perinatal experiences and postnatal patterns of stress activation led to completely different organizations. So I knew that even with a relatively simple model, it was very complex. But when you started thinking about human beings, it was beyond comprehension. And yet 90% of the kids I was working with ended up getting multiple of the same diagnoses, the same labels. They were all called ADHD or depression. So for a while, atypical bipolar or rapid cycling bipolar was popular, particularly with maltreated kids. And the truth was, this was not capturing what was going on. So here you have all this complexity, and you have a very crude, simple, descriptive diagnostic model where we were putting people into categories based upon their symptoms. But if you look at, before I went into psychiatry, I just finished a big cardiac intensive care rotation. And I knew, anybody who goes to medical school, you know about the heart. It's complicated and it does great stuff, but basically its function is to pump blood. And it's very simple compared to the brain structurally. And there's just nowhere near the same number of moving parts. Yet if you go into a pediatric ICU, there's dozens of distinct cardiac diseases. Now, the funny thing is, all of the symptoms that these kids have, even though they have hundreds of, well, let's say dozens upon dozens of different pathways to having problems with their heart, they all had similar symptoms. So the symptoms would be like chest pain or shortness of breath, fatigue. But we didn't say you had fatigue disorder or shortness of breath disorder. We wanted to know what was causing the problem. And so if you treated the symptoms, you would not help these kids. And yet that's exactly what we were doing in psychiatry, and we still are. And we're making huge mistakes. And so as in the beginning, I was a very compliant, very, I figured there's somebody out there that knew what they were doing, that there was some reason that they were doing this, and that they were, but I was actually not recognizing that psychiatry was a discipline that had yet to be able to measure the physiology of the organ that was mediating the problems, right? So you can measure the physiology in the heart and the liver and all that kind of stuff. But at the time I was training, it was very hard to look at the brain, to get in the brain and measure things and look at mechanism. And so other researchers like myself basically were equally dissatisfied, and the NIMH has been working on what's are called the research diagnostic criterion, which is to create a matrix of how is the cognitive systems organized and the social systems organized, and how are there, they give negative valence and positive valence, but these are basically about mood and affect. And so their idea was to come up with basically a checkerboard to describe a person as opposed to a label to give a person. And they're still working on this, but I had a very comparable idea that we just needed to kind of change the way we were thinking about this. And so after, probably 5-10 years learning the formal sort of range of neuropsychiatric diagnostic and intervention approaches, I basically said, this doesn't feel right. It's not addressing the issues. None of these kids are getting meaningfully better. And I need to just sort of we need to sort of look at this in a completely different way. And so I looked at it in the way that I looked at things, which is, again, biased. All of the models we have that are trying to understand complex human behavior are biased in one way or another. They just nothing captures the full complexity of the human being and human families and human culture and all of the things that influence who we are and how we function. So I decided to start with what I knew, and I knew a little bit about the brain. And my theory of change was that the problems that I was seeing, that I was being asked to address as a clinician, these problems were mediated or at least modulated by the brain. And so the more we understood about things about how the brain developed, about how the brain changed, the better we could be at intentionally creating interventions and activities and so forth that would change the systems in the brain that were mediating the problems we were observing. And I know this sounds kind of simplistic, but basically the way I thought about it was, listen, I know how to drive a car. I turn the key and I push my foot down on the pedal. But if my car breaks down, I don't understand what's under the hood. I can open the hood and look at it and kick the tires and act like I know what's going on, but I don't have any idea. But if I knew what was under the hood, if I knew how the engine worked, if I knew how the electronics were programmed, I would be able to go in and specifically diagnose the problem and change it so that my car would run again. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to look under the hood. Now, everybody, when the engine is working fine, when somebody grows up and their social and emotional and motor and cognitive functioning appears pretty normal, It's a little bit like us, driving a car. Your car works fine as long as you do a few things. But when the car breaks down, when something happens on the assembly line where the wrong parts are put in or some parts aren't put in, the way to diagnose that and fix it is to understand how the car works. And so this is what the neurosequential model is. We're trying to look under the hood and understand how the brain can be changed most effectively, why the brain appears to be doing what it is under certain circumstances. Now, again, part of the dilemma was this. You've got billions of neurons and even as more glial cells and synaptic connections and intracellular proteins and all kinds of things that make the actual granular understanding of the brain incomprehensible to a single person. So if I took all the neuroscience knowledge, the smartest neuroscientist in the world could not master the existing neuroscience content that's out there. Furthermore, if you could take all of what every neuroscientist knows on the planet and put it together, that's only a fraction of what will ultimately be known about how the brain and about how human beings work. So we're at a great disadvantage. What we didn't want to do, and what I see happening all the time, is a retreat into jargon. We wanted to create models that were able to capture things that were true, but were not the complete truth. And the reality is that's what all models do. The human brain, like I said, is just so complex. That's the reality of all levels of understanding. You always have to take something that's more complex, summarize it and digest it to some degree, and then present the simplified version. We do this all the time. So for example, this. Now, doesn't this look like a really nice picture of the brain? Yes, look at that. That's pretty complicated even. And everybody looks at this and go, yeah, that's the brain. There's the cerebellum, and there's the medulla, and there's the spinal column. And oh, by the way, let me just let you know, this is a model. The brain is not transparent, and you don't have a bunch of colored things in your brain. But this is useful because it helps you understand that there is a track that goes from the eye to the lateral geniculate. That's the optic nerve. It comes into the brain here, and then something happens, and it goes out. There's connections directly out to what we call the visual cortex. So you can teach about vision using this model, but it's not true. This isn't the truth. It's containing things that are true, summarizing them so you can learn them, but it's not true. This is a neuroimage from some of our works as a 5-year-old child with severe neglect. Anything that's colored is abnormally active, either underactive or overactive. The red things are overactive, the dark blue are significantly underactive. And what you can really see is that this looks cool, right? And it looks like, oh my gosh, he's a sciencey guy. But the truth is, we don't really know how to interpret this because this is a model and it has to be connected to function. And a recent study that came out, which you'll learn more about if you do NMT, showed that all of our neuroimaging studies are severely underpowered and basically uninterpretable, which means that all the stuff that people have been reading about this part of the brain does that, and this part of the brain does that, that's probably not accurate. The number of the N number required, or the number of subjects required to make comments about these complex things because of this, because of the complexity of the brain, is in excess of 1,000, 2,000, 10,000. And there were not any studies, there are very, very few studies that have subject numbers that are that high. So the body of evidence in our field is very scant. And this is part of what accounts for the slow progress for people's improvement, even when they get care. Now, people do get better, but we still don't know exactly what is making them get better. We have a lot of good clues, and all of the clues point to the fact that what makes people get better isn't the medicine or the right diagnosis. It's getting into relational connection with people who are consistent, predictable, kind, caring. And we'll talk a lot more about this both in NME and NMT. But that was the dilemma. I was a clinician, and I was faced with this incredibly complex mess. And I realized that if I wanted to study trauma, which I was interested in the impact of developmental trauma on how people grow up and change, I needed numbers that were in the tens of thousands. And there's just no way to do that unless you work with the public systems that are caring for children who have been exposed to trauma. And the only way to work with those systems is to provide something that will help the frontline person doing the work, it will help them do their work better. Because you cannot go into like a child welfare system and externally impose upon them a research protocol and expect it to be completed on thousands and thousands and thousands of children and families without some pushback from the frontline people. So long story short, we ended up developing the neurosequential model of therapeutics, which is starting with clinicians working with clinical populations, predominantly children who had been abused and neglected, and predominantly within the child welfare system and the mental health system. And then later on, the juvenile justice system, and then early childhood. But the bottom line was it was a clinical approach. And we developed, and I'll talk a lot more about this, and this is part of what you're going to learn how to use. We developed an assessment that allowed us to have a web-based data set that clinicians who were trained in this model would add to this data set. And over time, we were able to be an evidence-generating model. And I'll talk about that in a second. So in the beginning, we had the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And once this was formalized and we started to export it, it became clear that, and again, one of the first places we tested this was in an early childhood setting. Basically was the equivalent of a therapeutic preschool. These kids did better, a lot better when we used this approach. But then we sent them to a public first grade, and they started to regress in their progress. And by the third grade, they were struggling as much as ever. And what we realized was that they were going from an environment that was developmentally sensitive, that was providing developmentally appropriate NMT guided interventions, to an environment that had a complete misunderstanding of what their behaviors were. And so these kids, when they would be inattentive, they were labeled ADHD and given psychostimulants. If they acted out, they were marginalized and punished. And rather than understanding these kids and creating a developmentally sensitive intervention, they were experiencing very, very punitive things. So we developed a package, a beta, and the beta process basically finished just in the last year or two. We developed an approach to bringing these concepts into educational settings, and that is the NME. And then it became clear that the families that were caring for these kids also needed to learn more about these concepts. And we developed this parallel NMC, the neurosequential model in caregiving. And over time, as this spread, we've developed a whole variety of specialized tracks and iterations of this overarching approach. the core concepts that you will be introduced to and you'll be learning are present in NMT, NME, NM Sport, the neurosequential model in reflective supervision, the neurosequential model in early childhood. And we have a number of other tracks and emerging iterations where these concepts have relevance and where we're intentionally teaching people in a standardized way. And again, you're going to learn a lot more about this, but let me just give you a feel for what has happened with the growth of this model. In the beginning, the only people that were really doing this were people that were in my clinic, in our clinic, at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. And ultimately, I would go out and I would talk to people and I would give a presentation. I'd say, man, we're having a lot of success with maltreated kids who are delayed and have had neglect and who are 2 grade levels behind and who are impulsive and aggressive and cutting and all of this stuff. And then I would describe what we would do. And then I would hear later on that people were saying that they were using my model or the neurosequential model, and they were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And it was at that point we realized that, oh my gosh, we need to develop a standardized way to introduce people to the concepts and the principles. And even though this is not what I wanted to do, I am not an implementation scientist. I did not want to develop this. No offense. I mean, I'm glad we're doing it now, but the idea of sort of developing the content and the process required to do this the right way, it was daunting. And I just didn't want to do it. So finally, after I went and gave grand rounds at a place in Georgia, and this is when I was in Texas, and about a year after that, I got a call from the Georgia Board of Psychology, and they said, we have some concerns about your method. And I'm like, what method are you? I don't know what you're talking about. They said, well, there's a psychologist here who's using the Dr. Perry technique, and it says that it's something that you've developed and endorsed. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it turns out that, as you will learn, one of the interventions we sometimes recommend for individuals who have had significant early neglect is therapeutic massage, so that they will get used to touch in a healthy way, because a lot of them develop touch aversion and so forth. And so I had described one of these cases where we had done a sequential process of somatosensory work that included therapeutic massage, and then dyadic relational work, and then interpersonal relational work, and then cognitive work, and described the sequential process of healing for somebody who had this severe early neglect. Turns out this guy apparently tuned out the rest of the lecture after he heard that I did therapeutic massage, because everybody who came into his office was getting a massage. And I said, oh my God, and I explained that that's not what I teach and that's not what we think. And it was at that point I realized we need to go ahead and train people formally to do this. So in 2008, we manualized the NMT. 2012, the NME was manualized. And since that time, and it's interesting because we have not really been out pushing this. I mean, we've actually, sometimes we tell places that we don't think that they should do this because they're not quite yet ready. They don't have the stability to do this. So the uptake of this has been surprisingly rapid. And I think it's surprisingly rapid because, as hard as it is to do, and it really is hard, as you will see, it's a lot of time, a lot of effort. People feel that it helps them do their clinical work, and educators feel that it helps them do their work in schools. And we have some evidence to support those subjective impressions. So it's grown significantly, and it is now all over the world. And this is actually old by now, but you can see that there's tremendous saturation in North America, a lot in Australia. There's not many people on the inside of Australia here, so it's mostly on the coast. Northern Europe, we have a lot of saturation. There's the NMT was initially spreading it still is spreading very rapidly, but I think NME is probably our largest growing component of the model. And after, later on, we're going to talk about the metrics, the assessments that we do, and the certification process. And this basically shows the growth of the number of certified clinicians. And I think we're up at around 7,000 currently. And we've got lots and lots of reports. We're almost at 100,000 NMT metric reports. And if you look at sort of the impact of this, just sort of extrapolating from the number of clinicians that are trained to the number of clients that they directly see over a year, or impact, and then the number of clinicians that are being exposed to the neurosequential model in one way or another, there's quite a big reach for this model. And we continue to be, one of the things that you'll learn is that this is intentionally a self-correcting approach. What you are going to be going through in certification and what people will learn right now when they get certified is different than what people learned 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And we keep trying to make it better. We're hopeful that we'll continue to improve and expand. And we're optimistic that this is a positive direction in addressing a lot of the challenges that we have in education, mental health, and other areas. And again, I just want you to remind you that we fully recognize that a lot of this stuff is wrong, that the models and the heuristics we use are oversimplifications of very complex things. And we'll talk a little bit about that next. But we do believe, and we do have evidence, that despite the fact that our oversimplification of these complex things are wrong, we know that they're also very useful. So let me stop there. Discard that.